Hey, welcome everybody to the Launch podcast with me, Anthony Delaney. I've not quite been able to work out my camera now, so you might see a bit too much nostril at some point or so. I'm delighted today to have a guest who's a Facebook friend, really. You know, people kind of say, oh, you can't really have Facebook friends, but I figure over time, if we kind of keep on sticking with people and if they're sort of being open and honest about their lives and their beliefs and things that are important to them, we can at least begin to get some sense of knowing somebody a little bit. And I think it's from that I've often been intrigued by the posts, by the thoughts of Scott Brennan, and quite a lot of them are not short thoughts either. You know, they're not just like what I had for my tea, but they're philosophical, they're theological, and they're very much birthed out of his life as a church planter, as a missional leader, and a spiritual mentor who's been deeply involved in Celtic Christian spirituality, and particularly within Scotland and Northumberland. But I know that his influence is wider than that. And for the last 4.5 and nearly 5 years now, he's been at Holy Island together with his wife Faith, and where you've been the community leader. I don't know if it still is their case for Cairn movement, etc. But you've been nurturing people, looking at spiritual health and your experience with regard to church planting and how to be healthy church leaders is something that I just know is going to be a great fit for us here. So welcome very much to the podcast today. Scott, how are you doing?
Thank you. I should get you to write my bio.
That's all right. I'm available for a very small fee.
Copywriting services.
Yeah. So you co-lead the community of Aidan and Hilda. Now,
Yes.
all right, I'll kick off with that. Who the heck is Aidan and Hilda, for those who may not know? Give us a little bit of the story of Aidan and Hilda, please.
So, Aidan is, I suppose, what you'd call a Celtic saint. Technically, Hilda is a Saxon princess, but she was mentored by Aidan. And Aidan was an Irish monk, and he was part of what I would describe as a missional movement. He came from Iona, where Columba had established a missional base, and was invited by King Oswald of Northumbria to come and disciple the pagan Saxons. So they weren't the easiest. In fact, it's quite an interesting story. The first person they sent went back and said that they didn't want to listen to the gospel. So when this person was giving a feedback, Aidan said, "Brother, you've tried to give them the meat of God's word without giving them the milk of God's kindness." So he was sent back to have a different missiological approach.
Okay, that's great. So many people would say we're kind of leaving now, and effectively the two great kind of belief systems which Christianity kind of has to contend with, certainly maybe in the UK right now, well, apart from the kind of all the political beliefs and whatever, but in terms of faiths, I suppose, would be Islam on one hand, and the other one would be like neo-paganism,
Yeah.
that people are very embracing of pagan. How did people like Aidan connect with the people who, again, who were worshipping that, in those kind of settings, who would be, in some ways, kind of animist, I suppose, and or whatever? How did that? What's the approach? What do you think we could maybe learn from such people even today?
Yeah, that was actually the thing that caught my attention to begin with. And within the Celtic Christian spirituality, they knew how to do incarnational mission. So, for example, one of the great stories is when Columba went to preach the gospel to the Picts in Scotland, the high druid, came out and started cursing Columba, and Columba cursed him back, and he was blinded. And for 3 days, he left the man to be blind. And then on the third day, he prayed for him to receive his sight. And his first words were, "Christ is my high druid."
Wow.
In other words, the culture that the Picts were part of saw the druid as a wise spiritual person. And so rather than criticizing it or opposing it, they baptized the images in the gospel. So they were really good at that.
Yeah, I think Christians can be a bit afraid of that sort of engagement, and effectively, if if it doesn't look like what we're doing, we just can kind of write it off that there's nothing to be redeemed there.
Well, if you think about it, the book of Acts is how did they move out of Judaism into Gentile culture? So for me, it's the same principle. And, when Aidan came to Whole Island, he had to deal with these ideas that they had about Christianity from a pagan perspective. So he learned how to interpret the language and communicate truth in kind of symbols that made sense to them.
Yeah, so missional spirituality, I think, is a term
Yeah.
you've used. What does that look like?
Well, I tend to think of missional spirituality as people who have a heart for the gospel, who actually are good at looking after their own soul. So I was a church planter for 20 years, and twice I probably had a kind of burnout experience just from pushing myself too hard. And I didn't really have the kind of prayer rhythms in place that I needed. And so, missional spirituality for me is how do you create contemplative activists, people who know how to do the works of the gospel, but also to do good personal spiritual formation.
That reminds me of, I think it was John Ortberg, but he was probably quoting somebody else. But he said, is the life inviting others to live the life that you yourself are actually living?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'd probably say, if people look at your life, would they want to follow you?
Yeah,
Often the leaders are more stressed than anyone else.
yeah. Follow me as I follow Jesus, if you can keep up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was, I think was it Dallas Willard said, you have to slow down to catch up with God.
I mean, I've not been as yet to Holy Island. So I've been over the years. A few people have said to me, "Oh, you've really got to go. You've really got to go." I haven't been, and everybody talks about when you get there. There's this sense of it being, I think they call it like the thin space, and this sort of, because it's such a prayer-soaked
Yeah.
environment and very beautiful environment. And obviously, if one can make a pilgrimage of some kind to that, which we can talk about, which should be good about. Maybe we can talk about what it looks like to do pilgrimage. But right now I'm living in the centre of Manchester, and yeah, there's a bit of green around here. There's a park around the corner. I go and walk the dog, but there's no sea. And I'm in an urban place, and obviously they say lots of the future, the way the nations seem to be going, is a lot more urban. How, without necessarily, me moving out to North Wales or something and living on the coast, how do you get these kind of rhythms in different environments or is it just, well, make sure you plug in your diary that every few months you get out to one of these places, or is it both?
Well, for me, it's a way of life. And things like pilgrimage are just one aspect of that way of life. Rhythms of prayer are something you can do anywhere. I don't think you have to be even outside. You think of the story of Susanna Wesley, she stuck a dishcloth over her head to pray. So for me, the principle is do we have rhythms of prayer and are they accessible? I think a lot of the time we put these pressures on one another to live up to an unrealistic expectation. Whereas within new monastic practices, we're helping people to actually pray without putting false pressure on them.
Okay, so what kind of rhythms?
Well, in the case of Aidan and Hilda, we have short, regular prayer through the day. So normally morning, midday, night. So the sort of thing that, Lectio 365 are doing uh, with, you know, short, regular prayer times rather than putting all the pressure on one big prayer. You've just got this kind of checking in with God. It's more like practicing the presence of God.
Yeah, yeah, that's good.
We use liturgy a springboard. We also encourage people to have silence, to have free prayer. It's quite flexible.
I think I read somewhere that you guys, when you got there was a garden that was neglected, and you kind of set about something to restore that. I mean, that's a metaphor, isn't it?
Yeah, I call it uncovering the ancient paths. So when we arrived, we have this incredible house that we live in that looks out to the castle and the sea. In fact, you can see the Farne Islands from my study, which is where Cuthbert had his prayer cell and his hermitage, and which is kind of significant. But this garden had been neglected, and the weeds were like 5 feet tall. Our ivy bush was probably 10 feet tall. And so the first thing we had to do was to cut back the weeds to discover what foundations were there. So you're right, it is a metaphor. There's something about recovering the ancient paths and planting seeds that will prosper for today.
Yeah. Yeah, and I suppose there's the two things, aren't there? Because what we're trying to do sometimes in prayer, I suppose, certainly for myself, is kind of remove the blockages, that get in the way, as well as putting in new seeds. It's what is it what are the weeds?
Well, it's the parable of the sower, isn't it? What kind of soil are we planting into? And I think that's the thing about the kind of way of life stuff, is that we have this practice that we call soul friendship. So we have someone who walks alongside us and is asking, well, where are the big stones that you're tripping on? And they help you kind of clear the path. So you're not doing it on your own.
Okay. And I suppose many people these days would identify, you've mentioned busyness, but there's also, technology, which is supposed to help us, and, fairly antisocial media and those kind of things that again, this speed of life, instant reaction and action and all of that is part of it. I read somewhere you talk maybe sometimes about like a detox of some kind to be able to how do we?
Yeah, absolutely. The way that I would do that is by just not being a slave to social media or not being a slave to email. When I worked for a large city centre church, we used to pray the Lord's Prayer every midday, and I used to change the words from deliver us from evil to deliver us from email.
Yeah, yeah. I'm often surprised. I mean, I don't know what you're like, so I'm not judging anybody on on this now. But I go on mine, and I mean, I pretty much have a clear it and sort it mentality to email. I can't stand it when if anybody shows me their email or even their messages and they've got like 800 unread and whatever, I'm like, that would just do me in. I gotta delete it. I either delete it or I leave it or I answer it. But usually I'll just want to sort it, just get it done and then get it out of my head.
Is that your personality type?
Maybe it is. Yeah. 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 Yeah, I just can't sit with it. Lots of stuff unanswered, undone. I like, they all feel like ragged edges. You're being a soul friend here, aren't you, Scott?
I am. Yes, I was saying, what's your motivation for needing to be in control of your email box?
No, yeah, anybody who knows me will know that obviously control is not a big issue for me.
I'm not sure if we're dealing with sarcasm here.
Yeah, swiftly moving on. All right, so I, I suppose part of that too is yeah, getting busy, being busy can give an illusion of a healthy life, because it's that whole thing of us wanting to respond that we're busy, so we feel valued and valuable, etc.
Yeah, it's identity stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. What's the kind of inner life then? As part of that
Yeah.
as I'm trying to not get too cluttered. And you talked about having those times to put into my day. I'll be honest, I've put in sometimes I'll stick it. I pretty much put things in my calendar. I don't have a to-do list. I just, if I'm going to do it, I'll stick it on my calendar. I think, right, I'll do it then. I'm not a big list person, but I think if I was going to put in 8 o'clock prayer time, 12 o'clock prayer time, 7 o'clock prayer time, for me, I'm just not sure unless maybe I could put reminders on. It just feel another thing to feel guilty about when I forget because I get too busy.
Yeah, I tend to say it's not about time management, it's about heart management. So what's in our heart Is there a desire to be with God? Or is there a desire to be busy for God? And I was a pastor and church planter for 20 years. And it wasn't until I moved to Holy Island that I realized I didn't really pray. What I did is I asked God to do the things that I was doing. And I don't think that's really what prayer's about. Prayer's about, union with Christ. And so for me, something about putting these rhythms in place just reminds me that I have union with Christ and I'm living out of that place. And so anything else, any other kind of false identities out of my, productiveness, what's really motivating that prayer. So it really challenges you to ask, why am I praying?
Yeah. Well, I suppose as you're talking about it, my go-to as you're thinking about the parable of the sower you mentioned before is that, well, there's one of these that produces 30, 60, 100-fold. So that's the one. That's
Yeah,
the one to
yeah.
go for. But actually, it is about not having the weeds and the rocks and the distractions and everything. That actually, you don't really produce that.
Well, interestingly, when Jesus is using parables, he talks about an enemy coming in the night and sowing thorns amongst the wheat. And so if you don't deal with the access points for the enemy, then you are vulnerable to things being sown amongst your harvest. That's a tricky one, though, because in the West, our identity is very much found in, what do we produce? And our metrics for successful church is often, budgets, bums on seats, buildings, all that kind of stuff. Whereas actually, we want to create people who are Christ-like. And so if our leaders can be Christ-like, then we have succeeded.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I mean, you've probably summed up there the theme that we had this year of the launch gatherings, which were, we want to look into that and say that we need to measure differently for church.
Yeah, what's our metrics of success?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I suppose, how would I measure that I'm becoming more like Jesus?
Well, I suppose does it have the fruits of the spirit? Are we gentle? Are we patient? Are we loving? Are we kind? That to me is really the signs. Are we submitted? Are we going through a death and resurrection experience? I think that's one of the hardest ones particularly for leaders, is can we be vulnerable about the hard things that we go through? Are we dying in front of our congregation?
Yeah. Yeah, it's good. Yeah, because we can, again, I think like ChatGPT could quite easily help you to put a 7 points talk together of answers.
Well, our apologetics are often based on being right rather than being humble. And so actually listening is one of the key qualities of, I would say, Christ-likeness. So do we have a leader that listens? I'd also ask, do we have a leader that limps? Because that whole thing of you can only trust a leader who limps. In other words, they've wrestled with God and they've come out the other side. But these are not metrics for success. Humility and vulnerability, we don't think of them as the kind of typical alpha male types.
No. No, I'll qualify this by saying I'm not 100% with Richard Raw, but I do certainly where he goes in terms of his Trinitarian perspectives. But I've been encouraged by the whole kind of second half,
Yeah.
falling upwards kind of idea of, just the reality of that, people, you don't want necessarily have to bleed all over everybody, but that you are, as we share, people will connect more with our struggles and our vulnerabilities than, which again, sometimes it's just promoting an unrealistic idea of success anyway.
Well, Roar's interesting because he talks about first half of life is only scaffold. Or another metaphor he uses is that first half of life is only container. and second half of life is content. So the scaffold would be career success, financial stability, raising a family, or if you're a single person, feeling secure in yourself. All of these things are just scaffold. When you get to a certain point in life and you've achieved those things, people have a crisis because they think, well, what now? And so I think, particularly for leaders, there's a point where you think, what are my priorities now? I've been married for 25 years. I've led a church for 25 years, and they're actually both doing well. But actually inside, there's a deep desire within me for something else, something richer and deeper. So that's second half of life stuff. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, and the things, I suppose, that get you success in the first half in church leadership ideas, really, I mean, you need some drive. You need
Yes.
some form of, let's make something happen, let's reach
Confidence.
out for more people and all those kind of
Yeah.
things. But they could end up leading to, a never satisfied, ongoing competition, which you never win because you're actually against yourself in that sort of way.
Jesus said you can gain the world and lose your soul.
Yeah, and you can gain
So
a bit.
I went to South America a number of years ago to see the kind of revival there, and huge stadiums. And maybe we've seen a similar thing in the megachurch movement where you gather a crowd, but actually there's not a lot of depth. So I think it's not an either or. I think if you can, Jesus died for the world, but he also died to make us into his image. So both of those things are true.
I think I saw something you wrote once where you mentioned something about a gift of completion. Of like, because ministry life can often feel like never ending,
Right.
etc. But maybe I think it was to do with pilgrimage. That
Yes. There's this idea that you actually start and finish something.
Yes, yeah.
Well, in America, they did a survey of pastors who had resigned, and the most common job that they did after being a pastor was a builder.
Really?
And they went into the building trade because they could actually start something, build it, and stand back and look. Yeah, I did that.
Yeah, that's good. And we've got to get better at that, celebrating our way along the way, I suppose. I often think back to, the idea, I suppose, in Genesis 1 of Jesus, of the God every day, just going good, 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 good. It's not done yet, but, even celebrating the progress in some way is, and then we'll get on to rest. So again, what's the, what do you, how do we learn to rest these days?
Well, just before we get on to rest, I think one of the reasons that we get caught up in the productivity thing is that we have an individualistic mindset. We're actually thinking, this is my task to achieve for my glory. Whereas actually, if we saw ourselves as part of the cloud of witnesses, that we are really just passing on the baton from one generation to another, I think we would have a different perspective on that. And so I think that's one of the things that drew me into, the church history and realizing that I'm just a part of this incredible missio Dei. God has got this plan, and I'm just a small part of it. And so I don't need to prove anything. I just need to be obedient.
Yeah. So, that's interesting. So as we're looking back at, again, people like Aidan and Hilda, and you're kind of fitting in on a long line.
Well, the interesting thing for me about Aidan is Aidan died when he was 58, and he was only on Holy Island for 11 years. Not long.
So actually, go back to that. I mean, it seems to me, were there like signs and wonders in his ministry, etc.? Would that be
Yes. So the thing that I really love about the Celtic Saints is it's very holistic. There's a wonderful book by Michael Mitten called Restoring the Woven Cord. And he says that if you look at the modern Western church, we've created these silos of, say, perhaps a church that has a high view of scripture, and then a church that has a high view of the spirit, and then a church that has a high view of, say, social justice, and then maybe one that has a high view of prayer and worship. and they don't seem to interact with each other. Whereas what you see in the Celtic church or the saints, that period, the Irish monastic movement, all of those things were integrated. And so when you read the story of Columba, there are loads of prophecies, miracles, and even angelic visitations.
Okay, so if I was driving along and listening to this now, I'd be thinking, what was the name of that book? So Michael Mitten,
Restoring the woven cord.
Boring.
And I promise I'm not on commission.
He's an Anglican guy, wasn't he? I think back in the day, Michael.
Yeah, he's one of the co-founders of the community of Aidan and Hilda, and he was very much part of the early Anglican renewal movement.
Yeah, yeah, very good. So, when people come and visit with where you are, whether I mean, actually, yeah, if they're coming in, connecting to this where you are, how what do you have like common threads of experience that people would report from that time?
Yes, definitely. It depends where they start. Sometimes people come as seekers, so they don't necessarily have a church or Christian connection, but there's something about the island. There was one time I was out walking my dog, and it was in the winter and it was dark, and suddenly this man appeared out of nowhere in the dark and said, "This is a very spiritual place, isn't it?" And then walked off. So people have that kind of experience. Often, I had a church team here just a few weeks ago, quite a conservative Scottish church team, and they weren't expressive or emotional. And in the first session I did with them, one of their team just burst into tears. And it's something to do with the presence of the Holy Spirit, the prayerfulness, centuries of pilgrimage. It just brings things to the surface.
So they're talking about this quiet revival.
Mm.
Other people want to talk about that. There seems to be, something going on, perhaps, which everybody's very keen to jump on the figures of. And I suppose and the fact is, it's the kind of thing, if you go looking for it, something, you're probably going to see more of it, which is encouraging. It's that whole reticular activating system. If you're going to buy a red Mazda, you're going to see more red Mazdas.
Notice it.
There's people noticing things that maybe, so pray is real and continues and strengthens. But I suppose if we have pilgrim people or people who are lost, who are then starting to look for some form of way to turn their lostness into a pilgrimage that in the end leads to something, and the end point is Jesus. What can we be doing as churches to welcome the inquisitive person who just feels there's something spiritual going on, like that person that you met that day, but happens to wander up to us at a bus stop, in a coffee shop, or even does the brave missional work that we should be doing instead of going out. We don't go out to them, but now they're coming into us. What do we do to help them? Not just on necessarily an intellectual level, and come on the Alpha course. How do we recognize and respond well to a spiritual searcher?
Yeah, I think the key for me is to actually be someone who models a way of life that they would want to follow. So my experience of dealing with, say, Gen Z is they want something authentic. It'd be quite easy to create a product or a brand and use that to draw people in. But if there's nothing authentic underneath, then what are we leading them into? I think we've learned enough now from, you know, the big kind of hyped up stuff that that's not going to work. So perhaps, well, this is maybe my thing, is that let's have leaders that live an authentic Christ-centered life in a way that young people look at that and think, yeah, I want to live like that. Now, of course, our churches need to have spaces where they can see that in practice and explore it. I wonder if that's the challenge, isn't it? It's how do we live a life that others would want to imitate?
I think if maybe it was something I saw somewhere about restorative rhythms,
Right, right.
as well, because that's going to again help me to be the person worth following in some way. Well, okay, I put my. I'm not disparaging it, but I put in my 3 times a day, and I start to look at liturgy, and I develop in these ways. What other things not just in a day, but across the course of a month, a year? Are there things that you should be cultivating, I suppose, so that we seasonally rather than just daily? What are the things that could help? And I suppose what
Yeah,
hinders?
so yeah, I hear what you're saying. I suppose the check in my spirit is that we just create another product. So, the fad for the next 10 years is the Celtic fad. We've already had the cell church fad, we've already had the alpha fad. This is now the cell church fad, and I'd really want to avoid that. I think anything that helps us to live authentically following Christ is good. It just so happens that in the time of the Irish monastic movement, they changed nations because they lived a way of life. And then they multiplied themselves through others through a culture of mission and discipleship. So, whatever looks like an authentic culture of mission and discipleship, I don't really mind. I think it's got to be true to who you are and true to the context that you are in. But anywhere we can have rhythms of prayer and anywhere we can, you know, worship and disciple people, I just think that it's inspiring to look back at these stories of people like Aidan and Hilda and see that even though there's a pagan culture, Christ can be a really attractive figure once again. So I'm not answering your question. I'm kind of avoiding your question because what I don't want to do is to sort of create a new task list of, well, I've now got to do these 5 things. Because one of the things we do in Aidan and Hilda is we do what we call an explorer process, which is that you take about a year with a soul friend to ask heart questions. When Jesus was asked, "What must I do to receive eternal life?" He flips the question back, and the answer that's given is love God with your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And so taking a year to really look at those things, the heart, the mind, the soul, and the strength, and are we good at self-care as well as neighbor and God? That really shapes the kind of holistic motivation. And then out of that place, something is very authentic. And so I think one of the most important things that we can do is actually begin with ourselves and our own heart motivations.
Yeah. So would like Columba in sending others and these people, did they have, I mean, did they have a program? So I'm thinking like Benedictine monks and, the
Yeah.
rule of Benedict and, that was pretty prescriptive in terms of do's and don'ts and all of that. Or, I accept what you're saying, but at the same time, are there frameworks and helpful
Yes.
things?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the language we tend to use is the language of the trellis. So my understanding is that the word trellis comes from the Latin and it just means like a framework. The beauty of a trellis is that you don't put a trellis up to look at the trellis. It's there to carry the weight of the fruit and the growth. And then once you have the fruit and the growth, the trellis is hidden, but it's still there giving the support. So things like, yeah, a spiritual DNA, what matters to you? What is God calling you to? Things like a soul friend, a buddy system to be faithful to that calling. And then the third thing, which would be part of the trellis, would be, well, what does community look like for you? How do you actually live this out? How do you sharpen one another in community? So those frameworks are probably what any healthy church would have. So it's not rocket science. And interestingly, you talked about Benedict. When you read Benedict's rule, he said this is for beginners. It's just to get you started. But once you start to become a spiritually mature person, you shouldn't really need that. these do's and don'ts.
So the ivy that was growing, because I lead Ivy Church now, I'm interested. Did you put a trellis up for that, or is it still there? Did you?
Well, we cut it back by quite a few feet, and we had to put a wire netting up at the same time.
That's interesting because again, I mean, I think when I first came here and I was very much on the just grow big, reach more plan, we
Right,
did it,
right.
but it was a bit wild and it was all over the place. And it kind of, in some ways, like you say, there was a lot of outward growth and it went all over, but I'm not sure about the depth. So I always, there's a long, I won't go into the detail of why it's called Ivy Church and the history of it. 1893 it's died, but there's, I'm just interested when you talked about, and you mentioned the ivy, and I thought, well, it's interesting how God does cut back and,
Yeah.
prune and,
Yeah.
as well as just the undisciplined pursuit of growth.
Well,
Which,
remember when they did a survey in both Willow Creek and Saddleback, and what it actually uncovered was it was 3 miles wide and 2 inches deep, and that was their own findings. So there was something about the church growth movement and about product that lacked that depth to it, and I think it's being correct. So people like John Mark Comer, all of his kind of stuff is attracting a next generation, which is looking for something much deeper.
yeah, I like, I mean, don't write in, but I mean, it doesn't really say much original. It's just,
It doesn't say anything original.
no, it brings it all. It's like, oh, yeah, okay, yeah. He's a good collator of all kinds of other things.
He's a very good communicator. He's a very good summarizer, and he packages it very well.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's excellent what he's doing. But it's one of my friends in America said he's basically discovered Episcopalianism.
Yeah. So, if one was a beginner, in this sense, and you're looking for some primers, some things that are going to help with regard to, even looking back at Celtic Christianity for rhythms of prayer and simplicity, hospitality, etc. Where might one go and look for, just to help get started on some of the head stuff? But then from that, we don't just want to do that, but what is, would it be good to? How do we start putting stuff like this into practice?
Yeah, so I don't think it's something we should do on our own. Look for, well, in terms of intellect, there are lots of good resources. Ray Simpson, who has been my mentor, he's written many books. He's written over 40 books. The primer, I would say, is called New Celtic Monasticism for Everyday People. Quite a mouthful. New Celtic Monasticism for Everyday People. It's a really good primer. And then there are some great little resources. I've got one in front of me here. It's called Prayer Rhythms for Busy People. So it's just a little book, and you can just carry it around with you. But then I would encourage people to use things like Lectio 365 to look for prayer groups that you can be a part of. Ideally, you can see something in your local church that creates a culture together, or you can become part of a new monastic community, which normally sits alongside the local church. It tends to be translocal rather than local. So there's a number of frameworks that you can use.
Okay, so if somebody was to be interested, particularly in where you're at and where you're doing, what's the best way for them to find out more?
So there's a great website called visitlindisfarne.com, and that will give you all the accommodation and the retreat houses. My Facebook page always has stuff that's going on, retreats. I just did a retreat called Healing in the Celtic Christian Tradition. So there is information out there that you can get a hold of. If you're going to come to Whole Island, you have to plan ahead because it's booked up well in advance.
Great. Well, Scott, I've really enjoyed spending this time with you,
Good
and
to be with you.
it's been so helpful to be focusing on some of these things, which, again, for the inner growth, not just the external growth, which often we're focused to look at as leaders in churches, but to look at
Yeah, my thing is, can we become contemplative activists?
contemplative activists. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, fantastic. Please, would you pray for me, for us, for
Sure.
everybody who's listening right now or watching? Thank you.
Lord, thank you for your modeled life to us. You are literally incarnational. You lived among us and listened to the Father and followed the Spirit's lead and empowerment. And we want to do the same. We want to be like Christ and to give you the glory. And so I pray for each person who's listening or watching this podcast. And I pray particularly for Anthony and the work that he's doing and for the church he's leading at Ivy. I pray for organic growth with deep roots, that both of those things would be in place and that he would find a way to fulfill the dreams and passions that are on his heart without losing his soul. And so I pray for a healthy soul and a healthy church, and that would reproduce leaders across our nation for the good and for the glory of God. Amen.
Oh man, good. You've given me the title for this one, I think, as well in what you prayed there. So that was great. Bless you. Thank you so much,
Bless you
Scott. I really
too. You're
appreciate you
welcome.
taking the time. For anybody else who's listening, if you've enjoyed this, please do share it. Let other people know about it as well, and subscribe so you don't miss any more. We've got some great stuff coming up. But again, just want to say thanks very much to Scott Brennan. God bless you and your work there, and thanks for being on the Launch podcast.